The year is 221 before Christ. 177 years before Julius Caesar will be assassinated on the steps of Pompey's Hall in Rome. 285 years before Pompey will be buried in ash. 533 years before Constantine will see a sign in the sky. Rome, in this year, is not yet an empire. It is a republic, a city-state on the Italian peninsula, growing rapidly, but still generations away from conquering the Mediterranean. Alexander the Great has been dead for 100 years. The Hellenistic kingdoms he left behind are quarreling over the scraps of his conquests. The great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia are fading. The peoples of northern Europe are scattered in tribal communities, building in wood, writing nothing down. But on the other side of the world, 6,000 miles to the east, across deserts and mountains and steppes that no European has ever crossed, something extraordinary is happening. A young king, 38 years old, has just completed a conquest that has taken him 10 years, and that has ended a period of warfare lasting more than 250 years. He has defeated 6 rival kingdoms. He has unified, under a single government, an area larger than any empire in the Western world at that time. He has created a state of perhaps 20 million people, more than any nation in Europe. He has built roads, dug canals, connected walls, standardized the writing system, the currency, the weights and measures, the axle widths of carts. He has done all of this in 10 years, and he has given himself a new title, a title that no one in China has ever used before. He has called himself Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. His name before the title was Ying Zheng. His dynasty was called Qin. The word Qin is pronounced roughly like the English word chin, and it is from this word, Qin, the name of a dynasty that lasted only 15 years, that the entire country, 2,000 years later, still takes its name. China. Tonight we travel to the other side of the ancient world, to a civilization that was, in many ways, as sophisticated as Rome, and in some ways, more so, to a young king who dreamed of unifying a continent, and who did it, and who then spent the rest of his life searching for the one thing his power could not give him: immortality. To understand what Ying Zheng accomplished, we must first understand the world he was born into. China, in the centuries before the unification, was not one country. It was many countries. The period from roughly 475 to 221 before Christ is known in Chinese history as the Warring States period. It is one of the most violent and creative periods in human history. During the Warring States, China was divided into 7 major kingdoms and several smaller ones, each ruled by its own king, each with its own army, its own laws, its own system of writing, its own weights and measures, its own currency, its own customs. The 7 great kingdoms were Qin in the northwest, Zhao in the north, Yan in the far northeast, Qi in the east, Wei in the center, Chu in the south, and Han in the middle. These kingdoms had been fighting each other, more or less continuously, for over 200 years. The warfare was vast in scale. Armies of hundreds of thousands of men marched across the Chinese landscape. Sieges lasted for years. Whole populations were displaced. Prisoners of war were, in some recorded cases, slaughtered by the hundreds of thousands. The state of Qin, in one famous incident in 260 before Christ, is said to have buried alive 400,000 surrendered soldiers of the state of Zhao after the Battle of Changping. The violence was terrible, but the period was also one of extraordinary intellectual ferment. The great Chinese philosophical traditions were born in the chaos of the warring states. Confucius had lived and taught in the century before the period began. His followers, the Confucians, argued for a government based on virtue, education, and the proper ordering of social relationships. The Taoists, followers of the mysterious Laozi, argued for a government that governed least, a state that left its people alone, that followed the natural way of things. The Mohists argued for universal love and against offensive warfare. The legalists argued for something very different. The legalists believed that human beings were, by nature, selfish and untrustworthy. They could not be governed by appeals to virtue. They could only be governed by clear laws, strictly enforced, with harsh punishments for those who disobeyed and generous rewards for those who served the state. The legalists believed in a strong central government, a powerful army, a detailed bureaucracy, and the absolute authority of the ruler. The state of Qin in the far northwest had adopted. The state of Qin was, by the standards of the Warring States period, a strange place. It was located in the far northwest of the Chinese world, in the Wei River Valley, in what is now the province of Shanxi. It was geographically on the edge of civilization. To its west and north lay the vast steppes of Central Asia, inhabited by nomadic horse peoples who raided the Chinese settlements periodically and could not be controlled. The people of Qin, living on this frontier, had developed over centuries a culture that was more militarized, more disciplined, and more brutal than the cultures of the eastern states. The other Chinese kingdoms looked down on Qin. They considered the Qin people to be semi-barbarian, rough, uncultured, lacking in the refinements of Confucian civilization. The great scholars of the eastern states did not generally travel to Qin. The great poets did not compose verses there. Qin was, in the eyes of the Chinese heartland, a backwater. But Qin had advantages that the eastern states did not. It had the frontier. Living on the edge of the nomadic world had made the Qin people tough, practical, and accustomed to war. Every man in Qin served in the army. Military service was not a burden, it was the path to advancement. A farmer who distinguished himself in battle could be rewarded with land, with rank, with exemption from taxes. The Qin army was, by the 3rd century before Christ, the largest and most effective fighting force in the Chinese world. It had the reforms. In the middle of the 4th century before Christ, about 130 years before the unification, a legalist reformer named Shang Yang had come to Qin and transformed its government. He had abolished the old aristocratic privileges. He had divided the population into small groups of families, each responsible for the behavior of the others. He had created a system of ranks, 20 in total, based entirely on military merit. He had standardized the laws. He had encouraged farming and discouraged commerce. He had made Qin into a machine, a state designed from top to bottom for one purpose: war. Shang Yang himself had been executed, torn apart by chariots, when his royal patron died and his enemies took revenge. But his reforms survived. They were too effective to be abandoned. By the time Ying Zheng was born, in 259 before Christ, the state of Qin had been. The story of Ying Zheng's birth is wrapped in scandal. His father, Zichu, was a minor prince of the Qin royal family, one of many grandsons of the king, with little prospect of inheriting the throne. He had been sent as a young man to the state of Zhao as a hostage, a common practice in the warring states where royal children were exchanged between kingdoms as guarantees of good behavior. In Zhao, Zichu was poor, obscure, and forgotten. He might have lived out his life there, in comfortable irrelevance, had it not been for a wealthy merchant named Lu Buwei. Lu Buwei was, by all accounts, one of the great political schemers of the age. He saw in Zichu an opportunity. If he could help this obscure prince become the heir to the Qin throne, he, Lu Buwei, would become the most powerful man in Qin. He spent his fortune on bribes and gifts. He arranged for Zichu to be adopted by the childless queen of the reigning Qin king. He maneuvered over several years until Zichu was named the official heir. And then, the sources say, he gave Zichu something else. He gave him a woman, a beautiful woman, from his own household, a dancer or a concubine. The sources are not precise. Her name is not recorded in the earliest sources. Later historians called her Lady Zhao. She became Zichu's consort. She bore him a son. That son was Ying Zheng, born in 259 before Christ, in the enemy state of Zhao, to a minor prince and a woman of uncertain origin. The scandal, the whispered rumor that would follow Ying Zheng his entire life, was that Lu Buwei was the boy's real father, that Lady Zhao had already been pregnant when Lu Buwei gave her to Zichu, that the future first emperor of China was, in fact, the son of a merchant, not a king. We will never know if this is true. The sources are contradictory. The rumor may have been invented by later writers who disliked the Qin dynasty and wanted to delegitimize its founder. Or it may have been true. The uncertainty hangs over Ying Zheng's story like a cloud. What we do know is that Zichu eventually became king of Qin, King Zhuangqiang, in 250 before Christ. He died 3 years later, in 247. His son, Ying Zheng, inherited the throne. Ying Zheng was 13 years old. He was king of the most powerful state in China. He was surrounded by advisors who were older, more experienced, and more ambitious than he was. The most powerful of those advisors was Lu Buwei, the merchant who had made his father king, the man who might, or might not, have been his real father. For the next 9 years, until he came of age at 22, Ying Zheng watched and learned. He observed the workings of the legalist state. He studied the rivalries of the other kingdoms. He waited. The conquest of the 6 kingdoms took 10 years. From 230 to 221 before Christ, Ying Zheng's armies, commanded by generals of extraordinary ability, above all the veteran Wang Jian, dismantled the Chinese state system, one kingdom at a time. The strategy was methodical, patient, and ruthless. Han fell first in 230. It was the smallest and weakest of the 6 kingdoms. Its fall was almost a formality. The Han king surrendered. His territory was absorbed. His people became subjects of Qin. Zhao fell next In 228, Zhao had been Qin's most stubborn rival. The state that had fought Qin to a standstill at the Battle of Changping a generation earlier and had paid for it with 400,000 dead. This time, Qin's armies were overwhelming. Earthquake and famine had weakened Zhao. The Zhao king was captured. Zhao became a Qin province. Wei fell in 225. Qin's engineers diverted the Yellow River and flooded the Wei capital, Daliang. The city, unable to resist, surrendered. The Wei king was taken prisoner. Another kingdom erased. Chu was the hardest. The great southern kingdom, controlling the Yangtze River Valley, was the largest of the six by territory and the most culturally distinct. Ying Zheng initially underestimated it. His first campaign against Chu failed. He then turned to his greatest general, Wang Jian, and gave him 600,000 men, the largest army Qin had ever fielded. Wang Jian, cautious and methodical, spent a year maneuvering before striking. When he struck, it was decisive. The Chu royal family was destroyed. Chu became a province of Qin. Yan fell in 222. Before its fall, the crown prince of Yan had sent an assassin to kill Ying Zheng, a famous episode in Chinese history in which the assassin, Jing Ke, approached the king with a poisoned dagger hidden inside a rolled-up map. The assassination failed. Ying Zheng, drawing his own sword, wounded the assassin. The guards killed him. Ying Zheng, furious, accelerated the campaign against Yan. The kingdom was overrun. Qi fell last in 221. Qi had been, for decades, a cautious neutral, trading with Qin, avoiding confrontation. When the other 5 kingdoms had fallen, Qi stood alone. Its king, isolated and terrified, surrendered without a battle. The last independent Chinese kingdom was gone. Ying Zheng, standing in his capital at Xianyang in the Wei River Valley, looked out at an empire larger than anything China had ever known. He needed a new title. The old title, Wang, King, was not enough. Every petty warlord in the warring states had called himself a king. Ying Zheng wanted something that had never existed before, something that would mark him as fundamentally different from every ruler who had come before. He chose 2 words from Chinese antiquity. Huang, which meant something like majestic or august, associated with the legendary sage kings of China's mythical past. Didai, which meant emperor or supreme deity, a word used in the oldest Chinese texts for the gods of heaven. He combined them, Huangdi, emperor, and he added a number. Shi, first, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor. The title was more than vanity. It was a statement of intent. Ying Zheng was not merely the king of Qin who had conquered 6 other kingdoms. He was the founder of a new order. He was the first of a line that would, he believed, last forever. He decreed that his successors would be called Shi Huangdi, the second emperor, and San Shi Huangdi, the third emperor, and so on, for 10,000 generations. 10,000 generations. The dynasty, as it turned out, would last 15 years. There would be only 2 emperors. The second would be a puppet. The line would end in fire and rebellion, just 3 years after the first emperor's death. But the title, Huangdi, Emperor, would survive. Every ruler of China, for the next 2,000 years, would use it. The last emperor of China, a boy named Puyi, abdicated in 1912. 2,133 years after Ying Zheng first claimed the title for himself. Military conquest was only the beginning. The harder task was transforming 7 rival states, each with its own writing, its own money, its own laws, its own customs, its own loyalties, into a single unified empire. The first emperor approached this task with the same legalist thoroughness that had won the wars. He standardized the script. Before the unification, each of the 7 kingdoms had used its own variant of Chinese writing, the same basic system of characters, but with local differences in form and usage that made documents from one kingdom difficult to read in another. The first emperor imposed a single script, known as Small Seal Script, across the entire empire. Every official document, every legal text, every inscription on every monument would henceforth be written in the same hand. This was, perhaps, the most consequential decision of his reign. The unified script meant that a bureaucrat in the south could read a report written in the north. It meant that laws could be published and understood across the entire empire. It meant that Chinese culture, despite the vast geographical distances, despite the many spoken dialects, despite the regional differences, had a common written language. That common written language still exists. Modern Chinese characters are direct descendants of the script the first emperor standardized. A literate Chinese person today can read inscriptions carved in stone 2,000 years ago. This continuity, this unbroken chain of written language stretching across 2 millennia, is one of the most remarkable cultural achievements in human history. And it began with a decree from the first emperor. He standardized the currency, the round coin with a square hole in the center, an image that has become, in modern times, a universal symbol of Chinese culture, was imposed as the single legal currency of the empire. The old currencies of the conquered kingdoms were withdrawn and melted down. He standardized the weights and measures. A bushel of grain in the north would, henceforth, weigh the same as a bushel of grain in the south. A foot of cloth in the east would be the same length as a foot of cloth in the west. He standardized with extraordinary practicality the axle widths of carts. The ruts in Chinese roads had been carved over generations by carts with different axle widths. A cart from Chu could not, literally, travel on a road built for carts from Qi. The first emperor decreed a single axle width. Every cart in the empire would, henceforth, fit every road. He built roads. His road network eventually exceeded 4,000 miles. Comparable in scale to the road network of Rome. The highways were 40 feet wide, with a central lane reserved for the imperial family. They connected the capital at Xianyang to every corner of the empire. He built canals. The Ling Canal in the south connected the Yangtze River system to the Pearl River system, linking, for the first time, the great waterways of northern and southern China. The most famous of the first emperor's construction projects was the wall. The idea was not new. The northern Chinese states, Qin, Zhao, and Yan, had each built walls along their northern borders over the previous centuries to defend against the nomadic horsemen of the steppe. These walls were not continuous. They were scattered sections, built of rammed earth and rubble, covering vulnerable approaches and river crossings with long gaps between them. The first emperor ordered these walls to be connected. He sent his most trusted general, Meng Tian, to the northern frontier with an army of 300,000 men. Meng Tian's task was twofold. First, he was to drive the nomadic Xiongnu peoples back from the border, to push them north into the deeper steppe, away from the Chinese farming settlements. Second, he was to link the existing walls into a single continuous barrier, running from the mountains in the west to the sea in the east. The work took years. Hundreds of thousands of laborers, soldiers, conscripted peasants, convicts were sent to the frontier. They dug foundations. They pounded earth into wooden molds. They carried stone. They worked in extreme heat and extreme cold. Many of them died. The ancient sources say that the bones of the workers were built into the wall itself, that for every mile of wall completed, 1,000 men were buried beneath it. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the human cost was real. The Great Wall, in its earliest form, was built with forced labor under terrible conditions by men who had been torn from their farms and their families and sent to the edge of the civilized world to pound earth in the desert. The wall the first emperor built was not the wall you can see today. The modern Great Wall, the stone and brick structure that snakes across the northern Chinese landscape in the photographs, was built much later, mostly during the Ming Dynasty in the 15th and 16th centuries. The first emperor's wall was made of rammed earth. It has, for the most part, crumbled away. Only a few sections survive, as low mounds of packed dirt in the desert, barely recognizable as a structure. But the idea survived. The idea that China needed a wall, a visible physical boundary between the civilized world and the nomadic world, persisted for 2,000 years. Every major Chinese dynasty rebuilt or extended the wall. The Great Wall of China, as it exists today, is the cumulative product of centuries of construction. But the first stones, or rather, the first emperor's most controversial act was the burning of the books. In 213 before Christ, the emperor's chief advisor, a legalist named Li Si, presented a memorial to the throne. The memorial argued that the scholars of the empire were a danger to the state. They were Confucians mostly, men who venerated the past, who quoted the ancient texts, who argued that the old ways were better than the new. They criticized the emperor's reforms. They praised the old kingdoms. They suggested in their writings and their teachings that the unification had been a mistake. Li Si's solution was radical. All books in private hands, he argued, should be destroyed. Not all books. Technical manuals on farming, medicine, and divination would be spared. But the histories of the old kingdoms, the philosophical texts of Confucius and his followers, the poetry, the classical literature, all of it should be burned. Only the imperial library would be allowed to keep copies. Private citizens who possessed forbidden books would have 30 days to hand them over. After 30 days, anyone found with a forbidden book would be branded on the face and sent to work on the Great Wall. The first emperor agreed. The burning was carried out. We do not know how thorough it was. The Chinese world was vast, and many books were hidden, But the intention was clear. The first emperor wanted to erase the memory of the old world, the world of the seven kingdoms, the world of Confucian philosophy, the world of independent thought. He wanted his subjects to have no past except the past he gave them. The following year, in 212, the persecution extended further. A group of scholars, the sources say 460 of them, were accused of criticizing the emperor and spreading forbidden ideas. They were taken outside the capital to a field and buried alive. This episode, the burning of books and the burying of scholars, became in Chinese historical memory the great crime of the Qin dynasty. It was, for Confucian scholars of later centuries, the defining act of the first emperor's tyranny. It was the moment when the unifier of China became the destroyer of Chinese culture. The irony is that the Confucian tradition survived. The books were hidden, recopied, memorized. The scholars who escaped the persecution carried their knowledge with them. Within a generation of the first emperor's death, the Confucian classics had been reconstructed. Not perfect, the first emperor was afraid of dying. This fear grew, the sources suggest, as he aged. In his 20s and 30s, he had been a conqueror, a man of action, focused on the immediate tasks of war and unification. In his 40s, with the empire secured and the walls rising and the roads reaching into every province, he began to think about the future. His personal future. The question of whether he, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, the man who had unified the world, would, like every other man who had ever lived, grow old and die. He did not want to die. He began to consult magicians. The Chinese tradition had for centuries included a strain of mystical belief. Alchemists, diviners, men who claimed to know the secrets of the spirit world. These men told the emperor what he wanted to hear. There were islands in the eastern sea, they said. Islands inhabited by immortals who had discovered the elixir of eternal life. If the emperor would send an expedition, the elixir could be found. The emperor sent expeditions. He sent a man named Shu Fu, a court magician, with a fleet of ships and hundreds of young men and women to search the eastern sea for the islands of the immortals. Shu Fu sailed east. He never returned. Later Chinese legends say that he reached Japan and that his followers settled there. The emperor, meanwhile, began to consume substances that his alchemists told him would prolong his life. Mercury, in particular, was considered by Chinese alchemists to have life-extending properties. The emperor drank preparations containing mercury. He swallowed pills of cinnabar, mercury sulfide, a bright red mineral that the alchemists associated with vitality and power. Mercury, of course, is poison. It does not extend life. It destroys the nervous system. It causes tremors, paranoia, memory loss, organ failure. The very substance the emperor believed would make him immortal was slowly killing him. As the years passed, the emperor became increasingly erratic. He traveled constantly, moving from palace to palace, never staying long in one place. He slept in a different room every night. His movements were kept secret, on pain of death. No one was allowed to know where the emperor was at any given time. Paranoia consumed him. He saw enemies everywhere. He trusted no one. He was perhaps going mad. Or perhaps the mercury was doing its work. eating away at the mind that had unified China, turning the great emperor. While the emperor searched for immortality in life, he was also preparing methodically for death. The construction of his tomb had begun almost immediately after he became king, when he was just 13 years old. By the time of his death, 36 years later, the tomb complex was the largest construction project in the empire, larger, perhaps, than the Great Wall itself. The ancient historian Sima Qian, writing about 100 years after the first emperor's death, described the tomb in extraordinary detail. Sima Qian was not a sympathetic writer. He was a Confucian, and he considered the first emperor a tyrant. But his description of the tomb has, in the centuries since, been partially confirmed by archaeological evidence. The tomb, Sima Qian wrote, was an underground palace. More than 700,000 laborers had worked on it. They had dug into the earth beneath Mount Li, near the capital at Xianyang, and had created a vast subterranean complex, a replica in miniature of the empire itself. The ceiling of the burial chamber was painted with stars, representing the heavens. The floor was a map of the empire, with rivers and seas represented by channels of liquid mercury kept flowing by mechanical pumps. Mercury, the same substance the emperor had been drinking in search of immortality, was now in his tomb, representing the rivers of his empire. The Yellow River, the Yangtze, the seas to the east, all flowing in mercury in the darkness beneath the mountain for a man who had wanted to live forever. Modern archaeological surveys have confirmed the presence of mercury in the soil around the tomb site. The levels are extraordinarily high, many times the natural background level. Something beneath the mountain contains a vast quantity of mercury. The tomb, in this respect at least, appears to match Sima Qian's description. The tomb also contained, Sima Qian wrote, crossbow traps, mechanisms designed to shoot anyone who attempted to enter. The entrance tunnels were sealed with molten copper. The workers who had installed the final treasures were sealed inside, so that they could never reveal the tomb's secrets. The central burial chamber has never been opened. It lies, still sealed beneath a great earthen mound, a pyramid of packed earth, about 75 meters high, surrounded by a park of pomegranate trees. The Chinese government has, so far, declined to excavate it. The technology, they say, does not yet exist to open the chamber without damaging its contents. The mercury, in particular, poses a serious... The terracotta army was not found by archaeologists. It was found by farmers. In March of 1974, a group of peasants in Shanxi province near the modern city of Xi'an were digging a well. The region was in the grip of a drought. Water was scarce. The farmers dug deeper than they normally would. At a depth of about 5 meters, their shovels struck something hard. They pulled out fragments of clay, pieces of a broken figure, larger than life-sized, with the unmistakable shape of a human face. They had no idea what they had found. The local authorities were called. Archaeologists arrived. They began to dig. And as they dug, the scale of the discovery became clear. Buried in 3 vast underground pits, arranged in military formation, were more than 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers. Each one was unique. Each face was different. Different expressions, different hairstyles, different features. Each soldier was dressed in the armor and clothing of his rank. Infantrymen, archers, cavalry, officers, generals. Some stood, some knelt, some held real weapons, bronze swords, spears, crossbow triggers, that had been sealed in the earth for 2,000 years and were, in many cases, still sharp enough to cut. Behind the soldiers stood horses, life-sized clay horses, more than 600 of them, some hitched to wooden chariots that had rotted away over the centuries, leaving only their bronze fittings and the ghostly impressions of their wheels in the earth. The terracotta army had been built, the archaeologists determined, as a guardian force for the first emperor's tomb. The soldiers were positioned facing east, the direction from which the emperor's enemies had come during the wars of unification. They were an army for the afterlife, a force that would protect the emperor in death as his real armies had protected him in life. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The soldiers had been made in sections, legs, torsos, arms, heads, assembled from molds and then individually finished by hand. The faces, in particular, showed an astonishing level of detail. Wrinkles, scars, expressions of calm, of determination, of weariness. Some scholars believe that the faces were modeled on real soldiers, that each of the 8,000 figures represents a specific, individual man who served in the emperor's army. The figures had been painted originally in vivid colors, reds, greens, blues, whites, blacks. The paint, exposed to air for the first time in 2 millennia, oxidized and flaked away within minutes of excavation. The soldiers we see today, the gray, unpainted figures that appear in photographs and museum exhibits, are ghosts of their original selves. In the emperor's time, they would have blazed with color. The discovery of the terracotta army was one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. It transformed our understanding of the Qin dynasty. It drew millions of visitors to Xi'an. The first emperor died on the road. In the year 210 before Christ, at the age of 49, the emperor was on one of his great tours of inspection, a journey through the eastern provinces, traveling with a vast retinue of officials, soldiers, and advisors. He had been making these tours for years, visiting every corner of his empire, inspecting the roads and the walls and the canals, leaving inscriptions on mountaintops praising his own achievements. On this particular tour, he fell ill. The illness, we do not know what it was severe. The emperor's condition deteriorated quickly. By the time the imperial procession reached a place called Shaqiu in the modern province of Hebei, the emperor had passed away. What happened next was one of the great cover-ups in Chinese history. 2 men, Li Si, the chief advisor, and Zhao Guo, the chief eunuch, decided to conceal the emperor's death. They had reasons. The emperor's eldest son, Fusu, was far to the north, serving with the army on the Great Wall. Fusu was, by all accounts, a capable and humane young man, and he was a critic of his father's harshest policies. If Fusu became emperor, Li Si and Zhao Gao might lose their positions. They might even lose their lives. So they hid the body. They placed it in the imperial carriage with the curtains drawn. They continued the procession as if the emperor were still alive. Officials who approached the carriage were told that the emperor was ill and did not wish to be disturbed. Meals were sent into the carriage at regular intervals. Documents were presented for the imperial seal, which Li Si applied himself. The weather was hot. The body began to decompose. The smell became, the sources say, noticeable. Li Si ordered a cart of salted fish to travel alongside the imperial carriage to mask the odor. For weeks, the dead emperor traveled through his empire, surrounded by courtiers who did not know he was gone, his body hidden behind silk curtains, the smell of his decay covered by the stink of fish. Meanwhile, Li Si and Zhao Gao forged a letter. The letter, bearing the imperial seal, was sent to Fusu, the eldest son. It accused Fusu of disloyalty and commanded him to step down from his position. Fusu, a filial son who had been taught to obey his father absolutely, complied. He withdrew from public life. The conspirators then placed the emperor's youngest son, a weak, malleable boy named Huhai, on the throne. Huhai became heir Shi Huangdi, the dynasty the first emperor had built to last 10,000 generations, lasted 3 years after his death. The second emperor, Huhai, was a disaster. He was young, inexperienced, and completely under the control of Zhao Gao, the eunuch who had engineered his succession. Huhai spent his brief reign in the palace, indulging himself, while Zhao Gao governed, or rather mismanaged, the empire. The people of China were exhausted. The first emperor's great projects, the wall, the roads, the canals, the tomb, had consumed an enormous amount of labor. Hundreds of thousands of men had been conscripted. Taxes were crushing. The legalist legal system, with its harsh punishments and its rigid demands, had pushed the population to the breaking point. In 209 before Christ, just 1 year after the first emperor's death, a group of conscripts, marching to their assigned labor site on the northern frontier, were delayed by a rainstorm. Under Qin law, arriving late for conscript duty carried the most severe consequences. The men, facing punishment whether they continued or not, chose to resist. Their leaders were 2 men named Chen Sheng and Wu Guang. They were peasants, not soldiers. They had no military training, but they had nothing to lose. They rallied the other conscripts. They armed themselves with makeshift weapons. They challenged the local Qin garrison. The resistance spread. Across the empire, in province after province, the people rose. The old royal families of the conquered kingdoms re-emerged. Former nobles of Chu, of Zhao, of Qi, of Wei raised their old banners and called on their people to challenge the Qin. The Qin army, once the most formidable fighting force in China, was now scattered and demoralized. Zhao Gao, in the capital, was more concerned with maintaining his own power than with suppressing the resistance. He pressured the second emperor to step down from the throne in 207 before Christ. He then placed a grandson of the first emperor, a young man named Ying, in his place. Ying lasted 46 days. In 206 before Christ, a rebel army led by a man named Liu Bang entered the Qin capital of Xianyang. Ying surrendered. The Qin palace was taken. The imperial library, the very library that had been preserved when all other books were burned, was lost to fire. The flames, the sources say, burned for 3 months. The Qin dynasty was over. 15 years. 2 emperors. The shortest major dynasty in Chinese history. Liu Bang, the rebel leader, would go on to found the Han dynasty. one of the greatest and longest-lasting dynasties in Chinese history, which would rule for 400 years and give its name to the majority ethnic group of China, the Han Chinese. The Han would inherit the first emperor's The legacy of the first emperor is, like the man himself, enormous and contradictory. He unified China. This is the single fact that outweighs everything else. Before him, China was many countries. After him, China was one country. It has remained more or less one country for the next 2,200 years. There have been periods of division, sometimes lasting centuries. But the idea of a unified China, the idea that the Chinese world should be governed by a single emperor, has persisted from the Qin dynasty to the present day. The modern People's Republic of China governs approximately the same territory that the first emperor unified. The borders have shifted. The northern frontier has moved. The southern provinces have expanded. But the core, the Yellow River Valley, the Yangtze Basin, the Great Central Plain, is recognizably the same territory that Ying Zheng claimed in 221 before Christ. This continuity is, in the long view of history, one of the most remarkable achievements of any political figure who has ever lived. The Roman Empire, which was roughly contemporary with the Qin and Han dynasties, fragmented into dozens of successor states and never reunified. The empire of Alexander the Great lasted less than a generation before breaking apart. The Mongol Empire, the largest land empire in history, collapsed within a century of its founding. China endured. And it endured in large part because the first emperor had created the infrastructure of unity, the common script, the common currency, the roads, the bureaucracy, the idea itself, that made reunification possible every time the country fell apart. He was also, by any reasonable standard, a tyrant. He burned books. He buried scholars alive. He enslaved hundreds of thousands of his own people. He drank mercury and went mad. He built a tomb of staggering extravagance while his subjects starved. He created a police state so efficient that a man could be executed for being late to work. Chinese history has never fully resolved this contradiction. The Confucian scholars of later dynasties condemned him. The legalist tradition admired him. Modern Chinese nationalists have celebrated him as the founder of Chinese unity. Modern Chinese liberals have condemned him as the prototype of Chinese authoritarianism. He was, perhaps, it is late now. Close your eyes. Let the first emperor rest in his sealed tomb beneath Mount Li, surrounded by rivers of mercury and an army of clay soldiers who have been standing guard in silence for 2,200 years. The tomb has never been opened. The crossbow traps may still be set. The mercury may still flow. The painted ceilings, if they survive, may still show the stars of a night sky that the emperor looked up at in life and wished would never change. Let the terracotta army rest, standing in their underground pits, facing east toward the enemies who no longer exist. Their paint is gone. Their weapons have been removed to museums. Their wooden chariots have rotted away. But the soldiers themselves, 8,000 of them, each with a different face, each with a different story, stand where they were placed more than 2 millennia ago by craftsmen whose names we will never know. Let Wang Jian rest, the great general who conquered Chu with 600,000 men and then, wisely, retired before the emperor could grow suspicious of his power. Let Li Si rest, the brilliant advisor who helped build the empire and then destroyed it with his own ambition. Let Zhao Gu rest, the eunuch who hid the emperor's death behind silk curtains and the smell of fish. Let the farmers rest, who dug a well in 1974 and found, 5 meters down, the face of a soldier who had been waiting in the dark for 2,000 years. Let the empire rest, the roads and the walls and the canals, the standardized script that 1 billion people still read, the name, China from Qin, that the whole world still uses. Let all of it, the conquests and the cruelties, the visions and the mercury, the burning books and the silent army, let all of it